Hi, everybody, and welcome to the last class of the semester. Before we get started, I've got someone here. She was actually a student in my class about 2 years ago in this very class. She's now working as a research coordinator at a psychology lab here at FIU. Her name is Natalia. She's just going to say something for a couple minutes. Natalia, let me unmute you quickly if I haven't already. Natalia, are you there?
Yes. Okay.
Perfect. Okay. All
Hi,
right.
everyone.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Sharman. I'm just here to talk to you all about a research study that we're currently running. Where's the button? Here it is. Yeah, so our study is called Using Technology to Understand Families' Daily Lives. The TIES lab is a lab founded by Dr. Adela Timmons here at FIU. Technology, data science, and relationships are the pillars of our research. With this study, we are using technology to assess caregiver to caregiver and caregiver to child interactions, and we're looking to see how different factors, including mental health conditions, impacts family interactions. So in the long term, we're looking to refine our application to provide a technological intervention called JEDIs, which are just-in-time adaptive interventions. So for this study, we are compensating families $200 for the completion of the whole study. It takes 2 months. There's 3 virtual visits, and there's a home data collection portion that involves just using wearables and completing 2 daily surveys for the duration of the 2 months. So our eligibility for this study is, low-income families with children 6 to 9 years old. Caregivers can be anybody, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and families can be of any compositions. The only thing is that, the participants must speak English or Spanish fluently. So if you're not eligible, and I recommend that you take a screenshot of this, you can still contribute by spreading the word, and you can be compensated for referring eligible families to us. You can get a $10 gift card for each family that you refer to us. So the only thing that you should take into account is that you would only get compensated if the family is enrolled in the study. That implies that the family is interested and eligible to participate. I know this is the last class. I don't want to take a lot of time. So if you have any questions, if you think you're eligible or you want more information, you can visit our website. Contact me at 305-684-3905 or by the email tieslab@fiu.edu. You can take a screenshot of this as well to keep it in case you want to contact me. And that's pretty much it from me. I look forward to hearing from some of you, and thank you for contributing to psychological science.
Thank you, Natalia. And this study is not on Sona. So if people want to participate, they should email you at that email address, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Can you do us a favor? Can you type that email address into the chat box for everybody so that they can see that?
Absolutely.
That would be fantastic.
And I'll send you a digital flyer in case you want to put that in Canva for everybody, or Canvas, in case anybody needs a reminder. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Perfect. Thank you, Natalia. Appreciate it.
Happy holidays.
Okay, a few things just before we get started then. Of course, you should have turned in assignment 3 and the extra credit. They were due as of 5 minutes ago, so you should have turned them in a few minutes ago. If you haven't already done so, if you could complete the course evaluations, you should see them in your MyFIU. I know a lot of you have done them already, but if you haven't done them, please fill those out at some point in the next couple of days. I appreciate that. As you should know, the final exam is Tuesday, so next Tuesday, that's the 8th, from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock, okay? I have not created a Zoom meeting just yet in Canvas, but I will do that immediately. I'll do that either right after class or tomorrow at the very latest. I'll create a Zoom meeting in Canvas, just where all the regular class ones are. So that's where you're gonna go to take the final exam. That's Tuesday from 5 o'clock to 7. It's non-cumulative, it's just like every other exam. Okay, So with that being said, we've got a few slides left to finish up on, so let's do that. So at the end of last class, I had just briefly introduced this idea here, which is that when we look at these real world cases that I discussed last class of Kitty Genovese, who was murdered, attacked over the course of about 40 minutes or so. And there were 38 people who saw or heard some part of the attack. And the first call to police didn't go in until I think it was like about 2 minutes after her attacker left, after being attacked for 40 minutes. And if you look at the delete the word case, which I also talked about last class, in which she was attacked on a bridge in Detroit over the course of somewhere between 10 and 25 minutes, depending on different accounts, until she jumped off the bridge into the waters below and drowned. And 40 people basically watched this attack happen, and no one did anything. And these sorts of real world phenomena led social psychologists to believe sort of this counterintuitive idea, which is that maybe if someone's in need of help, maybe it's best to be in a situation where there are as few bystanders as possible. It's counterintuitive, obviously, because you would think that if you're in need of help, if you're going to have a heart attack or something, you would think that you might want to be around as many people as possible so that someone is likely to help you. What these researchers hypothesize, though, is that is the exact opposite. What they would hypothesize is that if you're going to have an emergency situation, if you have that in a crowd of people, they're actually less likely to provide help than if you had an emergency in front of a smaller crowd or just one other person. So the belief was that the larger the crowd, the greater the number of bystanders, the less likely people would be to help. This is the concept, the idea that I introduced at the very end of last class. And I want to give you some examples of this. You should be able to hear my audio. I'm going to play a couple clips of real world events. And this first clip is a news report of a man, an old man who's in his 90s, who had his car stolen, which was caught on camera. And as you're going to see it over the course of this attack, he gets wedged between his car door and the car beside him, while his attacker is repeatedly punching him. And as you're going to see, there's a number of people who are standing right by and seemingly doing nothing. So let me show you this clip.
To a 91-year-old man in the parking lot of a Detroit party store so outraged police that members of the Violent Crimes Task Force hit the streets to find the suspect, and tonight they did.
It just got to the core of their souls, and they went out there and we made arrests.
They say they're sure he is the man caught on surveillance video punching the elderly man 21 times in an attempt to get his car. The victim, who was hospitalized for a night and who suffered many bruises, tells us it started when the suspect asked for a light.
He kind of caught me off guard, because when he come up and asked for a light, and he hauled off and punched me. You see, that kind of struck my attention.
It's very, very hard to even think about, because my husband is a loving, kind person.
You can see that during the senseless assault, the victim is caught between his own car door and another car and could not get away. You can also see that there were several witnesses who did absolutely nothing to help.
This is one of the most heinous incidents I've seen as chief. And I'm a little bit disturbed, not just by the assault on the 91-year-old citizen, but also the fact that we have other citizens that stood by and did absolutely nothing.
Just before
Lest you think this is an isolated incident, let me show you a couple other examples of something very similar.
A Good Samaritan who died trying to help a woman didn't get the same help from New Yorkers, as shocking video obtained by the Post shows the homeless man lying in a pool of blood for over an hour after being stabbed when he came to the aid of a woman who was being robbed. The stunning footage shows people strolling by 31-year-old Hugo Alfredo Teo Yax early last Sunday morning, where he was lying dead on 144th Street in Jamaica, Queens. The surveillance video shows multiple people over the course of more than 1 hour walking by the homeless man without calling for help. In one incident, a man comes out of a nearby building and takes a cell phone picture of the dead man before leaving. Moments later, another walker stops, leans over, and begins vigorously shaking the body before walking away. After more than 1 hour and 20 minutes, firefighters finally arrive at the scene and roll tail yaks over, revealing a large pool of blood.
And I'll show you a third. This is surveillance camera footage from Hartford, Connecticut. There's no sound on this one. Just going to draw your attention to the car coming down the screen right here. I believe that car is going to turn around to avoid going by this guy. And this is a cop car right here. So what we're seeing is that in each of these examples, someone's obviously in need of help, right? There's clearly an emergency. And yet these bystanders that are present seem to be doing nothing, right? What are we to make of this behavior? And I think the natural inclination, and I think some that's being reflected in the chat right now, is to blame these people for being uncaring and apathetic, to be angry at them. And I think there's a place for that. But I think that's a little too simplistic as well. As a social psychologist, we are trained to think about how the situation might have also played a role here. In other words, let's not quite jump to the conclusion that these are uncaring people just yet. That's the conclusion that some social psychologists came up with after they heard about the Kitty Genovese case back in 1964. And they came up with a model to explain when people will or will not provide help. And so before we get too angry at these bystanders, and I think some anger is warranted, but before we get too angry at them, let's take a look at this model so we can see some of the reasons why it might be that people do or do not provide help. First thing I want to do is talk about a study that these researchers ran where they looked at this. Okay, so remember, they're testing the idea that the more people that are present, the less likely anyone is to provide help. So here's what they did. They set up a study in which, people were told that as part of the study, they're entering a booth by themselves and they're going to be having a conversation over an intercom with various other people. Now, these were all, I believe, first-year undergraduate students. And so they're told that because some of the topic conversations might get sensitive, because they're going to be talking about things like how they're coping with their first year, because those topics are going to be sensitive, for the sake of anonymity, that's why they're placing people in their own separate booths. So what happens is that participants are randomly assigned to be told that they're having a conversation with either one other person, with 2 other people, or with 5 other people. So that's their manipulation of how many other people are present. And for the first few minutes of this conversation, everything is going as expected. But at some point during the conversation, one of the participants has what sounds like an epileptic seizure. So specifically, if you're one of these participants, you're having this conversation in this private booth over an intercom system, and imagine you hear the following. I could really use some help, so if somebody would give me a little help, could somebody help? I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die, help, seizure, and then it goes quiet. Okay, clearly someone is in need of help. Someone's having an emergency. Now, of course, this was all staged. And what the researchers want to know is how long will it take people to leave the room and get help? Thanks, guys. I missed my opportunity as a drama major, apparently. So what we're looking at is how long it took people to provide help. And specifically, what we're going to look at first off is the percentage of people who provided help within a certain time frame. Okay, so this is going to be the percentage of people who provided help within 1 minute and within 2.5 minutes. And remember, people were initially in a conversation with either one other person, 2 other people, or 5 other people. So once one of those other people has an epileptic seizure, the participant now thinks they're either alone, or they're with one other person, or they're with 4 other people. Okay, and what the researchers showed is this, is that if these participants were alone, then roughly 85% of them left the room and tried to find the experimenter to provide help for this person within 1 minute. But that number drops. If you think there's just a single other person present, the number drops by about 20%. If you believe there's 4 other people that have also overheard this person have a seizure, that drops to only about 30%. So clearly what we're seeing is that the more people that are present, the less likely any individual person is to provide help. And that same pattern holds if you look at the percentage of people who tried to get help within 2.5 minutes. With people who were alone, every one of them did. Every one of them left the room to get help within 2.5 minutes, okay? So right away, what we should be seeing is that everybody wants to help, right? It might take them a little bit, but everyone is willing to provide help, right? So these aren't uncaring, apathetic people. But if there are other people present, that number drops to only about 80% if you think there's one other person there, and only about 60% or so if you believe there's 4 other people there. Okay? So we're seeing support for this idea that the more bystanders that are present, the less likely any individual person is to provide help. This is known as the bystander effect. Okay? The finding that we're less likely to provide help when there are other bystanders is known as the bystander effect. And we see the bystander effect pop up again and again and again in the real world, just like those 3 examples that I showed you. But let's take a little bit more of a deeper look at the bystander effect. Why does the bystander effect occur? Why are we less likely to provide help when there are other people present? So what these researchers did is they came up with a model of helping. And basically the idea is that if someone's going to provide help, they've got to get through 5 different steps. We're going to go through each one of these steps. And as you're going to see, at each one of these steps is an obstacle that can get in the way of the person completing the step. And if they can't complete the step, then they don't end up providing help. So we're going to see, in other words, 5 separate reasons why, as you increase the number of bystanders that are present, that decreases the likelihood that someone will provide help. So let's take a look at their model. Now, clearly it's the case that if you're going to help someone who's having an emergency, who's in need of help, you need to notice that someone's in need of help in the first place, right? So the first step to helping is simply noticing that there's an emergency. Now, clearly, that's the case, right? That one's kind of obvious. Now, in all of these 5 steps to helping, the word or the phrase that's in red, that's going to refer to the obstacle that gets in the way of people completing this step to helping. So what gets in the way of us noticing that there's an emergency? Well, if you're in a crowd of people, the fact that there's so many other people present can distract our attention. And if we're distracted, we may not notice that someone is having an emergency in the first place. So for instance, if this was a normal semester and I was lecturing in a room of, let's say, 150 or 200 people, and one student had an emergency, they slumped over unconscious or something, let's just say, I may not notice that in a room full of 200 people because there's so many other people there. But if I'm teaching that person one-on-one and they slump over, well, of course I'm going to notice that there's an emergency, right? So the more people that are present, the less likely we are to notice that someone is in need of help because other people are distracting us, right? So if someone needed help in this crowd, would you even notice? Well, maybe not, right? Because there's so many other people, you may just not notice them. But let's say that we've gotten past that step, right? So let's say that people have noticed that someone's in need of help. The second step to helping, according to this model, is that we need to correctly interpret the event as one that is an emergency. Because there are a lot of situations where it's sort of ambiguous as to what's actually happening. It may not be clear as to whether someone needs help or not. We've got to interpret the situation. And we might misinterpret that situation. Are we misinterpreting something? If we see a man lying on the side of the road, it's not necessarily clear if that's an emergency situation or not. Right? If you come across this person while walking downtown, is this an emergency, or is this a homeless person? Or is it a drunk person who passed out? It's sort of unclear, right? As a general rule in social psychology, something we've seen many times before in this class, when we're in ambiguous situations, the first thing we do is we look to other people. What are other people doing? All right, we saw this when we looked at things like conformity, when we looked at compliance, right? And the same thing happens with helping as well. If we're in a situation where we think there might be an emergency, but we're not quite sure, we look to other people. How are other people reacting? And if no one else is panicking, then we start thinking, well, if no one else is panicking, it must not be an emergency, so I don't panic. The problem is that everyone else is doing the same thing, right? So everyone else is looking to you to see how you're reacting, and they're seeing that you're not panicking, so they don't panic. So you end up in a situation where you have dozens of people, perhaps, all thinking that maybe there's an emergency. They're all looking to each other to figure out how to behave. No one's panicking, so everyone concludes erroneously that there is, in fact, no emergency. You might have had this experience. Let's say, for instance, that you went to a classroom. Let's say that you were having class in a big lecture hall. And when you get to class, you see that there's 20 or 30 people waiting outside. And you assume, if no one's going in the class, that, well, I guess that means the prior class is going long. So you start waiting outside. And then the next person comes along and they see you waiting outside, and they conclude, well, I guess someone's in the class. So they start waiting outside. And the class grows, and there ends up being 100 people waiting outside the classroom until one person opens the door and realizes the classroom is empty in the first place, right? What's happened here? Well, what's happened is everyone's made a faulty assumption. Everyone has assumed that everyone else knows what's actually happening. And so everyone just starts following along. Someone asked, how does this differ from groupthink? Groupthink is a more active decision-making process. Groupthink occurs when you have a group of people who are trying to come to a certain decision, and they're talking amongst themselves and back and forth, etc. The bystander effect, and these steps occur even if there's no communication between people, right? We're just looking to see how other people are reacting. When this occurs, we are in what's called a state of pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic meaning many people, ignorance meaning we all think we know something that we don't actually know. We all assume everyone else knows what's actually happening, right? So pluralistic ignorance is a state in which people mistakenly believe that their thoughts and feelings are different from everybody else's, even though everyone's behavior is the same. So even though I'm not reacting and this other group of people is not reacting, I assume they must know something, which is why they're not reacting, right? So everyone gets in the state of pluralistic ignorance, where we all think everyone else knows what's going on. In fact, no one else actually knows what's going on. So what happened, in part, in, let's say, the Kitty Genovese case, where this woman was murdered outside her apartment building at 3 in the morning. What happened is that after this occurred, after police were interviewing people who lived in the apartment building, and they discovered that 38 people heard or saw some part of this attack and no one really did anything, some of the reasons that people said, or that came out for why they didn't do anything, was that they said they thought it was like a lover's quarrel. It was just like a couple who were arguing and fighting. They didn't realize that it was a murder, right? So what had happened is that they had misinterpreted the situation. And if no one else is yelling to get this person to leave this woman alone, then there must not be an issue. There must not be an emergency going on. So bystanders assume nothing is wrong because no one else looks concerned. And so some researchers wanted to test this idea here. And I'm going to show you a video. And what the video is not of the original study. It's of a recreation of the original study, but the basic idea is the same. So I'll describe it as we watch the video. There's also no sound in this video either. Okay, so there's basically 2 conditions in this study. In this first condition, this participant, this woman here, is told that she has to fill out some questionnaires in a room, and she's in the condition where she's by herself. So she starts filling out these questionnaires, then suddenly the smoke starts pouring in through a vent in the corner of the room. Once she notices the smoke, you're going to see a timer start. And the timer is going to time how long it takes for her to provide help. Actually, is there a timer? Oh, no, there's a timer on the next one. But as you can see, once she notices the smoke, she checks it out, sees what's going on, and then pretty quickly leaves the room to provide help. Right? In this next condition, this woman is the participant. The other people who are in the room with her, she believes are participants, but in fact are working with the experimenter, and they're instructed to not react whatsoever to the smoke. So once she notices the smoke, now we're going to start a timer in just a second, and we're going to see how long it takes her to provide help. All right, so she notices it. Remember, the first thing you do when you don't know what to do in a situation, you look to other people. So she looks to her right. She looks to her left. What's everyone else doing? And no one else is reacting. And you can kind of read her facial expressions. She's obviously confused as to what's happening, right? She thinks something's happening, it's an emergency, but no one else seems to be reacting, and she's placed in this weird situation. And we're now almost 6 minutes in. She still hasn't done anything. And you're going to see she starts to get increasingly uncomfortable as she starts wrestling with this dilemma more and more as to what's actually happening here. "20 minutes. I want you to imagine how long 20 minutes actually, she's finally rescued. She never actually got help. She's finally rescued by the experimenter. But I want you just to imagine how long 20 minutes is. That's a long time. And imagine how long that would be if you are seeing smoke pouring through a vent for 20 minutes and you don't do anything. Now, you could also imagine that this sort of inaction is sort of self-sustaining after a while. Because here's what happens. If you don't get help in the first 30 seconds or first minute, it gets increasingly more difficult to provide help, right? Because if you're a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes in and you decide to get help now, why didn't you get help 5 minutes ago? So the longer you go without doing anything, the harder it is to sort of break out of that inaction, because you just have to question yourself, why didn't I take action a while ago, right? When they originally did this study, the smoke got so thick in the room that people had to actually like wave it away so they could see in front of their face, and people still weren't providing help. Now, it's not because these people didn't care, but it's because they're completely misinterpreting the situation. This guy's name is James Bulger. When I think he lived in the UK, I believe it was. When James Bulger was 2 years old, he was kidnapped from a shopping mall. His mother turned away just for a second, and when her back was turned, two people took him by the hand and led him out of the shopping mall. In fact, it was captured on surveillance video. This is one of the people right here who's taking little James Bulger away. While he's being led away, James Bulger is crying and screaming and trying to get away. But his kidnapper takes him out of the mall and into the woods behind the mall and takes him on like a mile-plus hike, at which point they start pushing him around. They start taking rocks, his two kidnappers, and start throwing rocks at James Bulger. In fact, they beat him so much that they actually killed James Bulger that day. And they decided that to try to get away with this crime, what they were going to do is take his body and place it on some railroad tracks and weigh his head down with rubble. So the next time a train came, the train would hit James Bulger and people would think the train is what killed him. Now, this story is shocking enough, but there are at least two other shocking aspects about this story. One of them is that the two people who kidnapped James Bulger were 10 years old, John Venables and Robert Thompson, when they committed this crime. The second shocking thing about this crime is that in sort of an eerie coincidence, there were 38 people, which is the same number of people who claimed to have heard or saw part of the Kitty Genovese attack. 38 people also claimed to have seen James Bulger being led out of the mall by these two boys, crying and screaming and trying to get away, and no one did anything to help. Now, why did they not do anything to help? Well, imagine that you're one of these people, right? Imagine that you're in the mall and you see a little kid, 2 years old, being led through the mall by 2 boys of 10 years old. And the little kid is crying and trying to get away. Well, that's sort of an ambiguous situation, right? And if you come across that situation, you might think, is something wrong here? And you look to other people, other shoppers, and no other shoppers are reacting. And you assume, maybe he's just a brother throwing a tantrum, right? And so no one intervenes because every single person misinterpreted the situation as one that wasn't an emergency. So effectively, everyone's in the state of pluralistic ignorance. As a consequence, James Bulger never got the help that he needed, which resulted in his death. But let's say we've gotten past that step, okay? So let's say that we have noticed that there's an emergency. Let's say that we've correctly interpreted it as a situation that is an emergency. We still may not provide help because we've got to get through the third stage to helping. And the third stage to helping is taking responsibility. If you were alone, if I was teaching you one-on-one, okay, let's say you're the only person in the Zoom class and I'm here, and I seemingly have a heart attack and I slump over in front of my camera right now. I'm hoping you would do something, right? My life is in your hands and I hope that you would feel responsible for getting some help for me. However, if I were to slump over right now in front of my laptop, well, there's 100 of you or something in the class right now, right? And you suddenly feel less responsible for being the person to provide help, right? Because after all, there's 100 other people in the class. Why aren't they providing help? So what happens is that when people are present, when other people are present, the responsibility that we might otherwise feel for providing help for this person gets diffused among everybody. Instead of you being responsible, there's 100 people who are responsible. So in other words, the obstacle that's getting in the way of providing help is what's known as diffusion of responsibility. That feeling of responsibility gets diffused among all the bystanders. Keep in mind that diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance are sometimes confused. Just to be clear, the second stage of helping, interpreting that there's an emergency, the obstacle, pluralistic ignorance, occurs when we incorrectly assume there is no emergency. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when we know there's an emergency. It's just that we think it's someone else's responsibility to provide help. So what happened, for instance, in the Kitty Genovese murder, is that some people said that they didn't call the police while this woman was being attacked because they assumed someone else had called the police already. But of course, if everyone's assuming that someone else called the police, no one actually calls the police. Shannon, yes. So the question is, you said that making people aware of these situations will in the future make them feel more responsible to take matters into their own hands. Yes, I was actually going to mention that at the very last slide I have of today's lecture, is there has been a study that has looked at that. So we're going to get there in a second. Yeah, I've always said that the worst time for me to actually have a heart attack is during my lecture on helping, because you're all going to assume I'm just faking it and I'm going to die. So I should not have a heart attack for the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, so let's say that you've gotten past these first 3 steps to helping, right? You've noticed an emergency, you've correctly interpreted it as an emergency, you've taken responsibility to provide help, but you still may not help yet, because the 4th step to helping is that you have to know how to help. You have to know what to do. Maybe we don't know what to do. Maybe the emergency is that someone is choking at a restaurant. And you know that they have an emergency, and maybe you take responsibility because you're close by, but you don't know the Heimlich maneuver. You don't know what to do with someone who's choking. And so what happens is that if you're by yourself, you better help a person. You know, if I'm choking and you're the only person with me, I don't care if you don't know the Heimlich. You're going to try something, right? Hit my chest or my stomach or squeeze me or something. Do something to help me, okay? But if you were in a situation with, let's say, 10 other people and someone starts choking, well, now you might be thinking, you know, someone else must know the Heimlich maneuver here. And so you're less likely to step in to help someone because you assume someone else must know better than you what to do. Now, fortunately, in this day and age, because everyone has cell phones, we can always call 911, at the very least, right? If someone is in need of help. But that wasn't always the case, especially in the days before cell phones. So if we think of the delete the word case, for instance, this woman who's being beaten on a bridge, and you've got these 40 bystanders who are watching this happen, it may be that people just didn't know what to do. Maybe people didn't have cell phones, so they couldn't call the cops. And people may not be carrying guns with them, and so they can't just intervene. And so they may not know what to do at that point to provide help to this person. Now, this is partly why people like nurses, firefighters, people who are trained in things like CPR and first aid, are less likely to fall prey to the bystander effect, in part because they take more responsibility for helping, in part because they simply know how to help more than other people. So the obstacle that gets in the way of completing this step to helping is a lack of competence. We just feel like we're not competent enough to provide help to someone. Okay, this is what I said before. The more people present, the greater the likelihood that someone else has more expertise in how to help. So let's say we've gotten past this step as well. We know how to help, okay? We still may not help because there's one more step we have to get past, and that is actually deciding to help. And this is a conscious decision, a deliberative decision that we have to make. And it's at this stage that we might be inhibited from helping because of, let's say, the audience. So if you are, as the example I used last class, if you're walking down South Beach and you see someone on the beach seemingly passed out, you go to give them CPR and they're just sunbathing and they fell asleep, it's pretty embarrassing, but it's even more embarrassing if you just did that in front of 100 people who just watched you, right? And so the more people that are present, the more that audience might inhibit you from providing help. Okay, the more people, the greater the potential embarrassment, right? It's at this stage that we weigh the rewards and costs to helping. So remember last class, we talked about social exchange theory. And according to social exchange theorists, we will provide help if the perceived benefits to helping outweigh the perceived costs to helping, and we won't help otherwise. And so what happens is that because of audience inhibition, if the potential costs to helping are so high because of embarrassment or whatever, that changes that cost-benefit analysis. So maybe we won't provide help because the perceived costs are so high. Or another way to think about this, again, if you think about the delete the word case where she's being beaten on this bridge, well, these people might want to help delete the word, but she's being beaten by a guy with a tire iron. And there's a whole lot of costs associated with stepping in to try to help delete the word, because you might get beaten yourself, right? He might kill you. And so it may not be the case that people didn't want to help. It may be that they misinterpreted the situation, they didn't take responsibility, they didn't know how to help, they thought the costs to helping were too great, et cetera, et cetera. This is the same 5 steps to helping, just in flowchart form. So these are the 5 steps that we just talked about, and these are the obstacles associated with each of those 5 steps. I just had it, wanted to put it all in one slide. I think this is in your textbook, I believe. This effect, by the way, the bystander effect, this tendency to be less likely to help when there's other bystanders present, is a really powerful effect. And I'm sure that there are numerous people in this class right now who have been in a situation where you've fallen prey to the bystander effect. I have been in that situation. There was a number of years ago where I was on North Beach, just walking outside, and I saw an older man, I'm guessing in his 60s or 70s, probably his 70s, kind of fall down to one knee and kind of fall to the ground. And I was frozen there for a second because I didn't quite know what was happening. I had noticed the event, but I didn't know how to interpret it. I was stuck at that second step. And I remember thinking, this is an emergency and I am falling prey to the bystander effect right now. And I was still frozen in my behavior. Even though I knew exactly what was happening, even though I knew I was falling prey to the bystander effect, I was still frozen because I didn't quite know what was happening or what to do. Now, fortunately, after a few seconds, there was someone who was a little bit closer to them who helped them up and everything was fine. But I noticed at the moment that I was experiencing the bystander effect, and I still couldn't get past that tendency to want to not do anything because I didn't know what the correct behavior was. Okay, so as I mentioned just a second ago, and as someone asked just a second ago, a study has shown that just being aware of these obstacles can increase helping. And what this study did is they looked at a social psychology undergraduate class who had gone through a lecture on helping, just like this one, and they compared it to a social psychology class that had not gone through a lecture on helping. And at some point late in the semester, there was some sort of story whereby everybody in the class had to switch rooms, and so they had to walk from one room to another across campus. And on the way to the other room, what the researchers did is they staged an emergency. So basically they had a guy lying on the ground with a ladder. So it looked like he had fallen off a ladder, basically, and he was unconscious. And they simply looked to see whether people were more likely to help this person if they had learned about these 5 stages to helping and their obstacles. And that's exactly what they showed, is that people were more likely to help this person if they had learned about this in their social psychology class. So what that means is that having been here today, having gone through this lecture, means that if you're ever in a situation in the future in which someone might need help, you are more likely to help them. You still may not help them. As I said, this bystander effect is extremely powerful, but just being aware of these steps to helping and the obstacles makes you more likely to help in the future. If you are the person in need of help, you should also keep these 5 steps in mind, because you want to make sure that the bystanders, the people who are witnessing you have an emergency, don't fall prey to the bystander effect as well, right? So a couple things that you can do is, first off, make it extremely clear that you need help, right? You want to get people past the pluralistic ignorance stage. So you might say, I am having an emergency, call 911, right? By making it extremely clear that you need help, there's no chance that people will misinterpret the situation. That gets them past stage 2. Furthermore, another thing you can do is to single someone out. Instead of just saying, someone help me, say, you there, you help me right now, call 911. By singling the person out, you are directly putting the responsibility all on that person. That helps them get past stage 3, this diffusion of responsibility, right? So by doing just those 2 simple things, you can increase the chance that someone will help you, because it helps them get past the obstacles associated with helping. Okay, that's all I've got on the helping lecture. I have a few other things I want to talk about briefly, but before I do, let me take any questions that you might have on this section. Nothing? Okay. Okay, if that's the case, and if we have any time at the end of class today, I'll take any questions you have for exam 4 as well. Okay, someone has a question. Feel free to type, Shannon. And while you type your question, I will be posting the study guide, by the way, for exam 4. I'll try to do that tomorrow. Let me make a note of that right now, actually. Okay, so I'll post the study guide and I'll create the Zoom for the final exam. This class doesn't play a role in people not helping a homeless person in an emergency. Yeah, it's a good question. It could, but we want to think about this from a psychological point of view, right? So I assume what you're saying is, will people from a higher class be, let's say, less likely to help someone from a lower class? And that might be the case, and that's kind of a sociological question in a sense. From a psychological point of view, we might want to think about how being a higher class makes people, let's say, less likely to notice an emergency, or less likely to correctly interpret it as an emergency, or less likely to take personal responsibility, or make people feel less competent, or something along those lines. I'm not aware directly of research on that question, but it's a reasonable hypothesis that you have, and I imagine that there might be some differences possibly. Can you show the five-step slide again? I assume you mean the flowchart. Oops, this one. As I said, I believe this is in your textbook, I think, and it's the same 5 steps, the same 5 obstacles that I talked about in the lecture. Okay, so I have a few comments that I want to make just now that we've finished the semester on social psychology. I want to talk briefly about what I want you to take from this class, because I'm under no illusions that, I don't think you guys are going to remember the definitions of all these sorts of effects we've talked about in a year's time from now, right? And I'm not too concerned whether you remember those things. I don't really care if you remember a textbook definition. I don't really think that's important. Rather, what I think is important and what I want you to take from the class are a few things. First off, the first thing I want you to take from the class is that social psychology is applicable. I've tried to stress that throughout the semester via the examples that I've used to explain certain phenomena, that we can use social psychology to make the world a better place. And people have used social psychological principles to try to, for instance, reduce aggression at schools or to reduce stereotyping in people or whatever. There's a lot of real world applicability that social psychology has. But it's not just applicable in the sense of these large scale interventions, but rather it's applicable in your day-to-day life, right? I've tried to make this point throughout the semester that you can use social psychology yourself. Your behavior is dictated by all sorts of social psychological principles on a moment-by-moment basis. And so understanding how you're influenced by the situation in various ways helps you to behave better as well. So for instance, when we talked about cognitive dissonance theory, that's just not some abstract theory that exists somewhere out there. You've experienced cognitive dissonance. You've engaged in cognitive dissonance reduction strategies. You've experienced the fundamental attribution error, or perhaps the bystander effect, or you've engaged in various heuristics and biases that we've talked about. You can use what you've learned in this class, both in terms of analyzing other people's behavior, but also in understanding your own behavior, and in understanding various ways that your behaviors, your decisions go awry, go astray. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in another second. Second thing I want you to take from this class is that of critical thinking. It's often been said that university is there not to teach you what to think, but to teach you how to think. And I very much agree with that assessment. That's certainly true of social psychology, because people make claims about human behavior all the time. Okay? On the news and the media, you'll see people make all sorts of claims that if you institute this policy, this is how people will behave. This is how they're going to react to that. And most of the time, these people don't know what they're talking about. Or at least at best, they're kind of giving you their best guesses. Most people aren't even aware that there is a field that studies scientifically how people are affected by the environment, by the situation. They aren't even aware of this class of social psychology. So when you hear claims about human behavior, I want you to think about them skeptically, okay? I want you to ask yourself whether these claims that people are making are based in empirical science and whether they're consistent with social psychological principles that you've learned in this class, or whether people are just basically making stuff up to justify a certain policy. Okay, so I want you to use your critical thinking skills in evaluating claims of human behavior. Thirdly, and this gets at the very heart of social psychology, is that I want you to appreciate the power of the situation. All right, that's the fundamental thesis of social psychology, is that the situation we find ourselves in dictates to a large extent our behavior. And we don't often appreciate this. We think that people's behavior is a function of their personality. And we think that our own behavior is a function of our own personality. And although there's some truth to that, it's not the entire truth by any means. The situation that people find themselves in is a huge determinant of how people behave, including how you behave. And if we think of some of the most famous studies in social psychology, so I'm including Milgram's study, where people thought they were shocking someone until they died. The Stanford prison study, where people who were told that their prison guards randomly came to behave aggressively like prison guards. Or the Asch study. This is where people were judging the length of lines. And if everyone else gave the same obviously wrong answer, people tended to give the same obviously wrong answer themselves. Part of the reason that these studies are so famous is because they're so surprising to us. And the reason they're so surprising to us is because we don't appreciate how powerful the situation is in affecting people's behavior. We can't appreciate, unless we're in the situation, how powerful it is for someone in a white lab coat to tell us to continue shocking someone. We don't appreciate how powerful it is to have 5 strangers all give the same wrong answer and how powerfully that affects our own responses. And we don't appreciate how powerful the arbitrary roles that we're given are in dictating our own behavior. And so that's part of the reason I think these studies are so famous in social psychology, because they're so surprising. And they reveal, something I've mentioned multiple times in this class, they reveal that regular people like you and like me have the potential to do good and the potential to do evil depending on the situation that we find ourselves in. And so if there's one general theme from social psychology I want you to take from this class, it's that, is that to appreciate the power of the situation in dictating and shaping our behavior. But maybe most importantly, is that I want you to be able to use social psychology to become a better person. And that takes a little bit of explanation. So let me do that. Here's what I mean by that. Hopefully throughout this class, you have seen that a lot of human behaviors are fundamentally driven by certain underlying fundamental motivations. I'll give you a couple examples. We've seen in this class, for instance, that people have a natural tendency, this motivation to really think highly of themselves. We spent a couple lectures on this at the very beginning of the class, right? We like thinking highly of ourselves because we like that feeling that high self-esteem gives us. We've also seen another fundamental motivation is that we have this motivation to want to be consistent. We saw this in the cognitive dissonance section, right? That if we engage in a behavior, we want our other behaviors and our attitudes to be consistent with that. We don't want to express one attitude and engage in a different behavior. We feel like hypocrites. We have this motivation to be consistent. A third motivation we've seen in this class is that a lot of the time we don't really want to think deeply. We don't really like that a lot of the time. We want to avoid effortful thinking. And so when we looked at heuristics and biases, we saw this. When we looked at stereotyping, when we looked at persuasion, we saw the same theme pop up again and again. And so once we understand that a whole host of human behaviors are fundamentally driven by these fundamental motivations, then we start to realize that many of the ways in which we screw up are the result of those motivations. For instance, let's take this first motivation, this motivation to think highly of ourselves. Well, we saw that because we have this motivation to think really highly of ourselves, that results in all sorts of self-enhancement strategies. So at the beginning of the semester, we saw that because we really like to think highly of ourselves, that leads to things like self-serving cognitions and unrealistic optimism and downward social comparison, false uniqueness effect, false consensus effect, basking in reflected glory. There's all sorts of these biases that we exhibit that are all the function, all the result of this tendency we have to want to think really highly of ourselves. Or take the second motivation, this motivation to want to be consistent. We saw in the cognitive dissonance section that this motivation to be consistent leads us to start distorting information. It leads us to effectively start lying to ourselves when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with our attitudes. We feel a need to justify that behavior. So we start lying to ourselves a little bit. We start distorting the truth a little bit in order to reduce the cognitive dissonance that would otherwise be created. Or if we take this fundamental motivation to avoid effortful thinking, what we've seen over multiple classes is that that leads to all sorts of ways in which we come to wrong conclusions or we engage in suboptimal behavior. We saw that because we don't like to think very much, we'll often simply attribute other people's behavior to their disposition, which leads to the fundamental attribution error. We saw that because we don't like to think very much, we're often persuaded by unimportant variables if we're on the peripheral route to persuasion, and so people can take advantage of us. We saw that because we want to avoid effortful thinking, that means that we're sometimes likely to stereotype people because it's sort of effortful to have to override the automatically activated stereotype. So because of this tendency to avoid effortful thinking, we engage in all sorts of problematic behaviors. So what does this all mean? How do you become a better person? Well, if you understand that the ways in which you screw up are the result of these fundamental motivations, and you understand what those motivations are, you can work to correct them. So if the problem is that we have a tendency to think really highly of ourselves, to exaggerate ourselves, which results in all sorts of biases, then we need to recognize that we need to take our ego out of it. That's easier said than done, right? We like our ego. We like to feel good. We like when people think really highly of us. But because of that drive, that's leading you to distort information, to lie to yourself to some degree. To the extent that you can take your ego out of things, and you could admit that sometimes you're wrong, sometimes you make bad decisions, and that's okay. And if you can learn from that, then you will make better decisions in the future. Or if we recognize that the motivation to be consistent is resulting in cognitive dissonance reduction strategies, which leads us to lie to ourselves, to justify our past behaviors, we can start to recognize when we're experiencing cognitive dissonance. We can start to recognize when we're simply justifying our own behaviors, and we can stop lying to ourselves. We can be more honest with ourselves, and we can grow as a person as a consequence. Or if the motivation to avoid effortful thinking is leading to all sorts of these suboptimal behaviors, then that means that we should be willing to think. We should be willing to put that effort in. Maybe not all the time, but at least some of the times. We should be willing to put effort in. We should be willing to put effort in when we come across a new person, so we don't just simply mindlessly stereotype that person. We should be willing to put effort into thinking about the reasons why someone engaged in behavior, so we don't just fall prey to the fundamental attribution error. We should be willing to think when people are trying to persuade us of messages, so that we're not just simply easily manipulated by these people. So if you can do these things, if you can recognize these fundamental motivations and work in ways to counteract them, you'll stop lying to yourself. You'll be a better person. You'll grow more as a person. And so above all else, I hope that you can take that from this class. Okay. With that being said, we still have one more task to do, which is the final quiz. So let's open Top Hat and do that right now. Okay, everyone's got the Top Hat open, I hope. Then let's begin. All of these questions have to do with helping. During his statistics class this morning, Stuart was completely confused. He considered asking questions during the lecture, but he was afraid of raising his hand and making a fool of himself in front of everyone. Stuart's failure to ask questions most likely stems from which of the following? Is it diffusion of responsibility, pluralistic ignorance, audience inhibition, or stimulus overload? You've got 10 seconds. Three, two, one. Okay, so the idea here is that Stuart is not asking questions because he's afraid of the negative repercussions of there being an audience. In other words, the audience is inhibiting his behavior, which makes C the correct answer. Question number 2. According to some researchers, people will help for truly altruistic reasons, but only if A, the rewards outweigh the costs. Sorry, that should be outweigh, not outweight. B, they experience empathy. C, there are no other bystanders around. Or D, they don't experience diffusion of responsibility. So when will people help for truly altruistic reasons? And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we talked last class about one theory in particular that talked about the conditions under which people will help for truly altruistic reasons, and that is if they experience empathy. It's known as the empathy altruism hypothesis. It is true that we are more likely to help if the rewards outweigh the costs, but that's not for truly altruistic reasons. That's because we're benefiting in some way. And it's also true that we're more likely to help when there's no bystanders or when we don't experience diffusion of responsibility. But again, that's not due to truly altruistic reasons. Question 3. The idea that people will provide help to others only if the rewards outweigh the costs is based on which of the following theories? Social identity theory, the empathy altruism hypothesis, self-evaluation maintenance theory, or social exchange theory? You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so again, we talked about this last class that we will, the idea, the perspective that will help people only if rewards outweigh the costs is based on a theory known as social exchange theory. Question 4. Imagine that you see someone collapse on the floor while you are grocery shopping. You look to all the other shoppers to figure out what you should do, and no one is doing anything. You conclude that because no one else is reacting, it must not be a serious issue. Your failure to provide help was likely the result of an egoistic motive, pluralistic ignorance, diffusion of responsibility, or a cost-benefit analysis. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so in this one, people will say either B or C. They do the same thing here. Yep. B is the correct answer, pluralistic ignorance. Remember, the difference between the two is that pluralistic ignorance refers to a tendency to misinterpret the situation. No one else is reacting. There must not be an actual emergency. That's what pluralistic ignorance is. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when we know there's an emergency. We just feel like it's someone else's responsibility to do something. So that's not applicable in this case. All right, question 5. Question 5 is a really easy one. Your instructor, Steve, is which of the following? Is he A, a great teacher? Is he B, a terrific human being? Is he C, one charmin? Or is he D, not a member of a boy band, although given the right makeup and dance training, certainly has the potential to become one if he were to so choose, but of course never would, because cheesy pop music is foul and soul-crushing ear pollution that only serves to make us musically illiterate. All right, give me an answer, and I will close this. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, fantastic. What's the correct answer? Obviously, everything's the correct answer. That would be self-serving cognitions in action right there. Okay. We've got about 10 minutes left. So let's just get out of here. I'd be willing to talk about anything you want to as it relates to the class or the exam or any topics we've discussed or anything else. So if you guys want to talk about anything, let me stop sharing. Just let me know in the chat. And if you want to actually speak, you can raise your hand digitally and I'll call on you as well. Yes, I'm going to be adding the Zoom link on Tuesday. I'll do that probably tomorrow. I have not added SONA credits yet. If you want to do SONA studies, you have until tomorrow at 5 to complete the SONA studies, at which point the researchers have until Monday to assign your extra credit, at which point your instructors will go in, download your SONA reports, and upload them to Canvas. So it won't be until next week after the exam until we actually post your SONA, but you have until tomorrow at 5 to complete SONA studies. If you have a conflicting time for the exam, you could take an early exam. However, if you take an early exam, it's all essay based. There are no multiple choice questions. So just keep that in mind, that it might be better to try to move your other exam if possible. If you can't do that, then let me know and I'll get the TA to schedule a time on Monday for people. But again, there is no multiple choice if you do that. So it's all essay based. So keep that in mind.
Hey, Professor.
Yes.
Is there a specific way that we're supposed to submit, like, to show you that we did the SONA, or do you see it just from the account?
No, as long as in your SONA account, you've indicated that you are taking this class with me and you've assigned your extra credit points to this class, then I'll be able to see it.
Okay, perfect.
As long as you've done that. So again, I would double check, everybody double check to make sure you've added this class, you've assigned your extra credit points to this class. Make sure it's the right section of this class. Some people put a different section. As long as you've assigned it to my class, I'll be able to see it. You don't have to do anything.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. No, I'm just teaching. There's so many people that need social psychology. I just teach social psychology at the undergraduate level, basically every semester.
Hey, Professor.
Yes.
I don't quite remember what your policy was in the syllabus, so I figured I would just ask you now. I have your assignment 3 ready. I just needed to turn it in. I just completely dropped the ball and got swamped with some other work. If I turn it in to you today, would you give me at least partial credit?
If you email it to me immediately, as in the next 2 minutes, I can get you partial credit.
Okay.
Professor, I have a question. Is the final going to be the same way as the quizzes?
What do you mean? I mean, the final is going to be just like the other exams, right? So there's going to be
like
10 multiple choice questions and then 4 short answer questions.
Excuse me, what?
There's going to be 10 multiple choice questions, just like the other exams, and 4 short answer questions.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Professor.
Hey.
So I was reading the influence book and I got to the chapter on scarcity, and they were talking about how censorship can sometimes have like an adverse effect. So because it's more scarce, it like legitimizes the information. I'm wondering what you thought of like Twitter censoring like the election and stuff like that. Do you think that like kind of counteracts what they're trying to do?
Well, from my understanding, Twitter isn't not allowing comments so much as it's flagging comments if they're inaccurate. That's just tagging them. That's not them preventing you from seeing them, but rather just warning you that the comments are inaccurate, right? I think that's what they're doing.
Yeah, they do something like that. They say
I think that's fine. That's not censorship so much as just sort of a warning.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Professor?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to say you're an amazing guy. Congratulations once again on getting married, and thanks for an amazing class, man. This is nothing like it. You're actually like the best professor I've had on God.
I appreciate that, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's easy when the material is so fun, I think.
Yeah. No, you're just a really good professor. Even in a harder material, I think you're great. All right, later, sir. Thank you for an amazing semester.
All right, thanks. No problem. Glad you liked it.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I had a question about the debates. There was and I can't put my finger on it right now. There was a topic about, I guess, first impressions people give. How would that apply to like the political debates that were going on with the presidents and the vice presidents? If someone has already their point of view on someone, how would a debate sway them?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because things like confirmation biases and other heuristics that we use are going to lead us to see what we expect to see, right? And so I imagine if you were to poll, I mean, I can almost guarantee if you were to poll Republicans and Democrats after watching whether it's the presidential debates or vice presidential debates, overwhelmingly, Democrats will think that Biden or Harris won, and Republicans will overwhelmingly think that Trump or Pence won, right? That's just because, now, it's a little trickier than that, because chances are that people are Republican or Democrat because they already agree with policies that these people are already talking about, right? But given these heuristics and biases that we have, it's going to be the case that most people are going to see what they expect to see. It's not always the case. To the extent that you go into it with an open mind, that you're really, truly willing to be swayed, you could be swayed, right? It's just that it's very hard to do so. It's very, very difficult to have an actual open mind when you're listening to people, because everyone comes into these situations with these biases and tendencies and beliefs that change the way that they perceive this information. It's one of the things that I want people to strive towards, is have as open a mind as possible, partly for that reason. So otherwise you get into these echo chambers where you only ever expose yourself to things you already agree with, and you never hear about the other side, and that makes it really easy to stereotype the other side and things like that. So people can change their mind as a function of debates if they're in the right mindset, right? If they're open-minded. I'm just seeing the chat. Matthew, would be able to go over the types of aggression. Okay. So yeah, all this means, when we talk about the types of aggression, what we're really meaning is there's different ways to cleave aggression into different groups. So one way to cleave aggression is into hostile aggression, which is where you commit aggression and the point of the aggression is the aggression itself. So when you really want to hurt someone, that's hostile aggression. And you can contrast that with instrumental aggression, where we're using aggression to get something else that we want. We don't care about harming the person. We're just using that aggression to get something else. So that's one way to distinguish between types of aggression, hostile or instrumental. Now, but there's other ways that you could think about aggression as well, in a totally different way. These are not like different types of aggression, just different ways of dividing it up. But another way to think about aggression is in the types, or is in the, I guess, whether it's physical, for instance, if you're like hitting, punching, kicking, whatever, versus more relational aggression. And relational aggression is damaging someone else's relationships. So that would be like spreading rumors about them or gossiping about them. Giving someone the silent treatment is relational aggression. So they're just different ways of sort of cleaving aggression. So the difference, again, is hostile and instrumental is one way, or physical and relational is another way. I'm sure there's other ways you can think about it as well, but those are some of the more common ones.
Hi, Professor. I have a question.
Yep.
On behalf of the group chat, is there any way we can get extra credit for participating in the spots? Like if like a certain percentage of people do them?
That would
a lot
be
of my,
great, but
yeah, a lot of my classes is like 80%. I think if 80% of the class does it, then we get like an extra credit point.
I mean, that would be great, but unfortunately, I can't do that this time.
Okay.
That's a good idea for next semester.
Yeah, it definitely motivated me. I got all mine done already.
Because we've lost like almost the entire class, and so if I only tell you and not them, then that wouldn't be fair and blah, blah, blah. So I can't do that now, but I'll keep that in mind for future semesters.
Okay, thanks.
All right, no problem. Yes, I know there isn't a link in for the next class in Zoom. I'm going to create one tomorrow. There will be one in Canvas. Any other questions that anyone has? Okay, great. All right, well, thanks everyone. I will see you on Tuesday for the final exam. Good luck studying, and I'll see you then. Have a good night.